The National Schools Debating Championships 2022 would like to thank our premier partners, the Australian National University and Crimson Education, our major partner, the University of Canberra Faculty of Business, Government and Law, and our sponsor, Speaking Schools Australasia, for their support in making this tournament happen.
At the point at which recidivism is so high in society, and we see like the criminal justice system being so detrimental to anyone in it, we know there is a problem, and we know that we on Team Affirmative have to fix this problem. 3 points is out for today. Firstly, what are actually like non-violent crimes? Secondly, like how does the criminal justice system like actually affect people? And finally, like what are mitigating factors and what we think this looks like. So let's talk about what we actually think violent crimes are. We think that violent crimes are things like sex workers or drug possession or like stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family. And we think that the people that actually like commit these violent crimes are like in a position where they have to. These non-violent crimes, they have no other option other than to commit these violent crimes, non-violent crimes, to actually like live their lives, right? Secondly, how do you think the criminal justice system, specifically incarceration, affects people? So we think that like incarceration is like the most, damaging thing that you could possibly do to a person. At the point at which we see that like you cannot work for years on end, really like massively affecting your super and any like possible way to get a job outside of jail, we think that like you have no possible like way to live a good life once you've left jail. We also think that like whilst you are in incarceration, you are like very like vulnerable to brutalization, to like abuse, and we think that this is like super damaging to any like reoffenders or to anyone. And we think, at the point at which we are getting less incarceration time for anyone on the outside of the house, we are getting positive outcomes for them. And finally, like what are mitigating factors and what do we actually think this will look like and why do we think this is good? So we think that like the more severe your first sentence is, we think this means like you deserve like more mitigation, like as it comes to like your second incarceration, right? And we think that this is and we think this is because like you have been like let down by the like justice system because you've been like forced to be in like a situation where you would have to have reoffend. And we think that like this is something that only gets fixed when you start like actually start like identifying the issues of the justice system and fixing that. So we have 2 points to get to give in tonight's in tonight's speech. Firstly about like the principle of the justice system, and secondly about outcomes for reoffenders. So let's talk about the justice system. So we think the reason we have the justice system is to create like a safe society, and this could be like proven by 2 things, like taking unsafe people out of society, and more importantly, we think that the justice system's like main mechanism to create safety in society is setting a tone of morality, right? And we think that anything that we prosecute is perceived to be immoral, whether it is like innately immoral, like incest or like possession of drugs. We think these are things people think are innately moral, or whether we think that like it's immoral to actually hurt someone, like stabbing someone. We think that those are the things the justice system perceives as immoral. But we think that the issue with this is that the justice system enshrines these morals in society, and these morals that we think society actually follows. The issue is this, because the justice system is so prestigious and so old in like its creation and foundations, we think that the morals that actually enshrined in society are really damaging for society. We think that when the justice system was like founded, right, it was founded by rich old white men who were incredibly racist, who were incredibly sexist, homophobic, meaning that the morals that our society has to follow are like the most damaging morals to any sort of minority group that you could ever like imagine, right? And we think that when society is like actually idolizing and following these morals, we think that this is bad for minorities and puts everyone at a risk of being discriminated against. And we think that by principally changing the morals of the justice system and like introducing these mitigating factors as a result of like reoffending, we think that we are principally changing like these morals because we are saying like you don't like there are other reasons as to why you need to commit crimes, not just like so we think that principally we need to do that in order to have like a justice system that is actually enshrining the right morals in society for us to follow. And I'll take you in a second. Actually, I'll take you now.
Are judges more inclined to sympathise with rich white men?
Well, we think that like because the justice system is immoral, right? When we are removing this immorality, we're actually going to see judges less inclined to like have that bias, right? When we are like producing this sort of like societal narrative of like we think the minority people have been so like harmed by society. We are going to change that by like having mitigating factors, no thank you, that like directly benefit them. We are increasing like the value of minorities in society. Therefore, we don't think like under our side of the house, rich old white men will be more inclined to side with each other. So let's talk about like outcomes for offenders under our side of the house. So we think that like previously incarcerated people are not necessarily immoral. We think like, let's talk about like within the scope of Australia, we think like the most incarcerated group is First Nations people. And like what we think like they actually like offend for. We think that First Nations people offend and like, you know, steal things to escape like debilitating poverty that they are living, right? No, thank you. And we think that like these are like moral people who are just like ridiculously oppressed under a prejudicial system that has been like around for so long. And we want to make it so clear that these people going to jail is so incredibly harmful for them in two ways. First of all, in the short term, we think that it is like dehumanizing to go to jail. We think that within jail you could be physically, sexuologically and psychologically abused, right? And we think that like also this is a specifically negative place for racism and sexism. And we think that also if you allow someone like, you know, thank you, a minority like LGBTQ or if you're neurodivergent, we think that you are also going to be subjected to like negative harms in jail because of the toxic culture there. We think that like in the long term, the trauma you could receive from jail, or like the, being like disillusioned from society, like it's also massively impactful. We think in the long term as well, you're looked down on in society, and we think this means that like employers don't want to hire you again. And we think that it also means like being harassed if you do get into the workforce, like, oh, why did you go to jail? What did you do? Are you a horrible person? We think that that is like really bad and really socially ostracizing for you. And we think that like what this means, so thank you, is that reoffenders are more likely to offend because of the jail time they receive. So why do mitigating factors reduce this, even if you've already been incarcerated? So I think like the reason like that they face this discrimination in the first place is, as I've already talked about, the legal system is accepted as this beacon of like morality, which we've like already dealt with. And we think at the point at which like jail time is changed to be a mitigating factor, what we're doing is we're creating media talk about this, right? We're creating like a lot of buzz around like, no, thank you, what we actually think like jail actually is. I think that when the media reports become, you know, like about this like leftist idea, we think that what we do is we're introducing society to like the idea of a mitigating factor. And I think that's when it comes, the people that have been previously incarcerated become a very sympathetic stakeholder, right? Meaning that people in society, because they've talked about mitigating factors, because they know why people go to jail, and they know it's not always necessarily their fault, we think that means people don't think people that have been to jail are a bad person. We think that it also gets acknowledged that it's very hard to bounce back from jail. And we think that because the people that have been to jail are seen as like this underdog, other people in society have a moral obligation to help them because they're seen as vulnerable, right? We think what this means is we are deconstructing the societal narrative about previous incarceration, and we're creating more nuanced thoughts about like people's crimes in the first place. What this leads to is like the deconstruction of policies that stop people like rehiring people that have been previously incarcerated, right? I mean, we're giving people like a chance to come out of jail and get better jobs and get better lives for them. And we think, and we also think that by deconstructing that societal narrative, we are getting less ostracization for people in society, meaning that they are less likely to reoffend in the first place. And if they do after that, we think that we also get better outcomes from the fact that they are more likely to be rehired and be placed in a position where they can actually succeed and live in society well. And because of all of these reasons, we are so glad to propose.
The missing piece inside affirmatives analysis is that they rely on judges to carry out these mitigating factors. Judges like Judge Matthew Murphy in the United States, who prayed for a rapist because he thought that rapist was a good Christian person. He gave that person literally no jail time because he thought there was a good like Christian person, and they therefore didn't deserve any jail time for that crime. That was why the opposition's model never worked, because it relied on these like entrenched, like archaic systems that were inherently racist. And rather than literally just addressing the laws and the judges that like caused these problems in the first place, they'd rather just give like slightly less jail time for the like things that they acknowledge are probably not the fault of these like criminals in the first place. Firstly on some setup, then I'll do some rebuttal, and then be telling you why we get more equitable justice and actually decrease crime rates under our side of the house. So what do the offences in this debate actually look like? We largely agreed with the opposition, but we also thought it was things like tax fraud, money laundering, and cybercrime. Who committed these offences? It was like literally rich white businessmen who were trying to skirt the justice system and who were trying to get ahead in like the game. Why was this the case? For structural reasons. Firstly, these were in the scope of the debate because this was the only situation where a white judge was actually going to employ the mitigating factors that opposition wants to prop. Because we thought that the justice system was already inherently like favoured towards these people and discriminatory against minorities. But secondly, we thought that even if they do it, we thought that minorities were actually already given. We thought that minorities were like already given like a violent conviction, even if it wasn't a violent crime. For example, the trifecta like conviction in Australia, which like leads from an Indigenous person being given like from going from like swearing in society to being given like abusing a police officer. That was a violent crime, which meant that they weren't even in the scope of this debate. But thirdly, we thought that white rich business people were the types of people who did money laundering anyway, and therefore were more likely to be considered in that. But fourth, we thought that rich people were the only people who were actually able to employ the types of lawyers who would bring up these mitigating factors in court, because no, it wasn't automatically applied onto the opposition side of the house. You needed a lawyer to say, hey, you should probably employ this mitigating factor. We thought that like public defenders were never actually going to do this under the opposition side of the house. What would we prefer? We would prefer like a variety of things that were just clearly better at addressing the root causes that opposition wanted. For example, mitigating factors on the specific disadvantages that cause people to commit crimes. For example, like mitigating factors on crimes of necessity. This was good if you brought the characterization that a judge would employ like mitigating factors. But even if you didn't, we thought that there were other things that you could do, like altering the laws that continuously convict Indigenous people and First Nations people, for the kinds of crimes that the opposition wanted to talk about. We thought that these were just a very clearly less convoluted way of getting to the outcome that the opposition wanted to take you now.
So actually, right, the biggest issue with rich people with really fancy lawyers is that they never get found guilty. They never have to face any sort of sentencing in the first place. They're outside the scope of this debate.
Okay, they do get found guilty. That person was found guilty, but their sentence was like a prayer. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but we thought that like generally like these people are convicted, and we're like, as I'll be explaining later, just giving the judges an excuse to lower that sentence. Obviously, a majority of these people are convicted in the first place. Firstly, in response to what opposition tells us about recidivism, we have a few structural reasons here about why like that probably isn't the cause. Because we tell you firstly that jail is like probably bad, and like they probably just don't want to go back to jail in the first place. They characterize how bad being in jail is. But secondly, we thought that being in jail probably doesn't cause the non-violent crimes that opposition wants to talk about. Like maybe it causes you to become like crazy if you're in solitary confinement and like stab someone, but it doesn't cause you to steal a loaf of bread, especially if you're doing that as a crime of necessity. And also what they tell us here is that they get more people like, they get like less people convicted, and that was just an inherent good. Why is that an inherent good if you're just getting like less jail time for the white people that are characterized are like the only ones in this scope of this debate? But also no, they give us no structural reasons as to why they actually like get less people being like experiencing recidivism. Then on the principle, they tell us that like it's immoral and bad for minorities. A few things here. Why then would they not like change this for like minorities specifically, as opposed to like trying to address the entire justice system? But also then, why would they literally just not give any jail time to the First Nations people in the first place if they thought that that was such a bad thing? Also note that this was contingent on them actually getting like the outcomes that they want to talk about, and also contingent on them like proving that they didn't perpetuate the inequality that was already in the justice system, that already existed there. Also note that we thought that some non-violent crimes probably just deserve jail time anyway. For example, like selling drugs to like little kids probably deserve jail time even though that wasn't violent. How do we then get more equitable justice system? Note that this is responsive to what they tell us about characterization about First Nations people, because we thought that we'd like rather just like address the structural reasons that's causing them to be put in jail in the first place. So what's the problem in the affirmative? Firstly is that society increases sentencing for non-violent crimes more than under our side of the house. This was for a few reasons. Firstly, because we thought that the justice system ultimately wanted to reduce recidivism, and therefore they'd have to increase jail times in order to achieve that. Secondly, we thought that the justice system has to be seen by the public as carrying out retribution, as carrying out deterrence, and therefore, ultimately they had to increase the system in order to maintain that public image. And note that what the opposition tells you about ostracization for these people actually occurs more under our side of the house, because now people think that people who have committed a crime are being unfairly let out. They're just criminals on the street, and that's when you get the kind of ostracization that opposition wants to talk about. The third thing is that we thought that people question the justice system because they're scared that they're not going to be safe, because the justice system is giving lower sentences to people who have committed these crimes. Why was this so bad? It's because if the mitigating factors are applied to white rich people, as we've characterized that they do, then this thing means that minority people are disproportionately affected, because the white person who's been convicted for the same crime has those mitigating factors applied to them, but the minority doesn't, which means that they're getting a disproportionately higher sentence than that person does, even if the mitigating factors were applied in the first place. The second problem is that rich people are able to disproportionately get away with the crimes. We've already proved why these people are in the scope of this debate. And when the AFWAD reduces sentences for these people, they're able to continuously get away with money laundering, because there was a significantly less jail sentence for them. That was a major principal harm, because we gave the people less retribution for doing the exact same crime, for committing a pretty heinous crime, and we just gave them less jail time for no obvious reason. We thought these people already have money and power, and we thought that they ought to be convicted by not lowering the sentence under the opposite of the house. That was where the real principle lied in this debate. At the end of this, minorities are more unfairly convicted. We fix this by fixing the root issues that minorities face, by actually mitigating the factors that have caused them to be being convicted in the first place. We thought that judges are no longer able to justify reducing the sentence for their white buddies because they don't have this mitigating factor to do that. Why then do we decrease crime rates? The problem under the opposite of the house is that money laundering was always going to be a good option for people because it was so profitable. We thought that when you lower the jail time, you lower the trade-off that person has to make, and they're therefore far more likely to be able to continuously commit these crimes and not consider the jail time that they would face from that. And we thought that generally in society, I can't read my paper anymore, but generally in can we pause? Starting from 748. We thought that the trade-off for these people becomes sufficient, that they're just more likely to carry out money laundering under the opposition side of the house. Already said why that was such a big principal harm. But we also thought that systems in society leave minorities to be held accountable for crimes that they probably didn't even commit. And under our side of the house, you're able to mitigate for those crimes and ultimately achieve better outcomes for those people. Because we brought you better outcomes for these minorities and told you why it was so critically bad, we were so proud to oppose.
Negative, wanting to talk to you about how bias is ingrained in society against minorities. They fail to understand how this extends beyond the justice system and how this affects other groups within society who are classed by these same narratives that aren't changed, in fact are entrenched when we label minorities as people who are more likely to commit crimes, and that's why they need mitigating factors. That is why under our side of the house, we think it is always more important to have mitigating factors on the basis of the disadvantage someone's experienced as a result of the justice system instead. 4 things I'm going to do in this speech. Quickly do 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly about what we think the justice system looks like, and secondly about how this affects minorities. And then I'll do 2 points of substantive. Firstly about outcomes for all minorities in society, and secondly about the outcomes for the justice system. Negative team is characterised to us that all judges are really bad and that they will never consider any of the mitigating factors. Firstly, this is what they want to present to us. They are never actually able to create any benefit with their supposed counter-model of minority factors. No, thank you. Because that would be symmetrical under both sides if they're just looking at mitigating factors. But we don't necessarily think this is true because we think judges are actually held to look at these mitigating factors and that they do actually have to understand that this is a factor. They do still have maximum sentences, so judges are obliged to engage with this. We also think that they're more likely to engage with this if we accept their characterization that these are rich white old men, when it is on the basis of that justice system, as opposed to they need a free go because they're First Nations. We think that's an example where they're more likely to be discriminated against. We also think, as I'll explain later, we'll get more public scrutiny under our side of the house, which is why we're able to enhance the ability of judges to be fair on minorities in particular. Quickly on the examples that were brought to you by negative, we think it is inherently unfair to cherry pick examples, particularly from a completely different system of law from the US, and we don't think this is reflective of how law works within Australia. So we think to the extent they want to talk about this, they're not actually engaging within this debate. Very briefly, we think white-collar crime is symmetrical under both sides of the house because we think these people have the lawyers to get out of being called guilty and therefore aren't actually going to be punished and sentenced anyway. Quickly on how we think this impacts minorities specifically. So negative team has told us that crimes of minorities aren't out of necessity. Let's really clearly step through again what we heard from first half. Firstly, people who have come out of prison and incarceration are more likely to struggle finding jobs. What we think this means is they actually have an incentive and a need to turn to things like going back to selling drugs or stealing a loaf of bread. I'll take you in a moment when they're actually unable to feed their family.
Why don't you give them any jail time for that?
Look, we think it is far more important that we're able to analyse how this person is impacted within society. We have mechanisms by which we change this. Under your side of the house, by putting mitigating factors just on the basis of minorities, we think that leads to far more discrimination. So it actually won't get the effects you talk about of having no sentencing for them whatsoever. We also think that in the cases of violent crime, there are still places for sentencing, but we think under our side of the house, we are actually able to improve that sentencing so it's better, which I'll tell you about in substantive. So we think that these people do actually need to commit crimes, but there is still a place for incarceration in that first circumstance within society, and mitigation doesn't necessarily mean that there is never any punishment. That's under both sides of the house. In fact, we think it just means there is more adjustment factors on the basis of that. Quickly, why we don't think their model is ever going to be sufficient. We don't think it's viable to have people labelled on the basis of their minority, because we don't actually think that's, firstly, it's quantifying disadvantage, which we think is really, really damaging towards people in society. When you tell them, you're a minority, no thank you, therefore we think you're likely to commit a crime. We also think this perpetuates into other people in society, which is hugely damaging. And we also think that it instills this narrative that the person caused the crime because they're part of a minority. We think that is always damaging when you tell someone that the mitigating factor is that you're First Nations or that you're a woman or you're from a certain minority. That's why you're causing crime. We would never ever stand for that. We also think that this focus on retribution to society is not actually a good thing, like Negative wanted to tell you. In fact, we think under our side of the house, we're able to make the people of minorities or people who've experienced incarceration as a failure of the justice system a more sympathetic stakeholder, which means the media is more able to look upon them favourably, and we have less need for cold-hearted retribution. No thank you. Let's move on to substantive. Firstly, about outcomes for minorities, which I briefly already talked about. We think, as we've told you at first, justice really projects what morality looks like, and we think this reflects on minorities as it forms ideas about who they are. For example, ideas that Indigenous people are more likely to steal, or poor women will sell themselves to prostitution, or even the idea that queer people, for example trans women, are actually sexual predators of other people. We never support this, and we think this is really damaging, but thank you to all people in society, particularly and even those who have not engaged with the justice system themselves. What we think this means is it has racism outside of that fostered within society, which is not something we support. We know that this is how a lot of laws are made within society in this really discriminatory way. For example, no thank you, often having laws around we created for the persecution of black people because that is a further discriminating against the group. So what we actually think this means is that the justice system as a beacon of morality is more likely to hurt everyone within society, particularly when it's on the basis of your minority is the reason you're committing a crime, as opposed to it's the justice system that's inflicted negative things upon you as a result of disadvantage. That is why it is always better from the angling of affirmative. We think the scale of this point is so massive because of all the people in society who experience some level of disadvantage as a minority, and even though they aren't engaging with the justice system, have no need for this negative racism or things like that to perpetuate. That is why it is so important to protect them. No thank you. Let's talk about outcomes for the justice system. We think there are a few key ways we're able to get more accountability. I'm going to talk firstly about how we think we're able to gain that more accountability through the justice system and make sure that it's doing better sentencing into the future. No, thank you. Firstly, we think recidivism is actually a failure of the justice system because it's means the justice system has actually failed to fulfill one of these key aims of justice, which is to rehabilitate people. We think that lowering these sentences as a mitigating factor on the basis of previous incarceration, which has failed because this person has reoffended, we think that shifts the blame from the individual and acknowledges the failure of that institution. And we think that shows that the legal system is the reason for this mitigating factor. That's shifting blame away from those individuals, which is reducing the hate. Please go ahead.
So should someone who repeatedly sells drugs to children get a lower sentence?
Look, we think there are a few factors within society that affect crime, and they interact in a lot of different ways. We actually think someone who has gone to jail in past and no longer has reason and ability to access a job should be able to have some lowering sentences and maybe mitigating factors, and that is what we stand for under our side of the house. We think more severe crimes are addressed in different ways, regardless of mitigating factors, and mitigating factors doesn't mean the sentence doesn't exist at all. On to these second two mechanisms about shifting blame. Firstly, we think this means broader society sees that the justice system isn't necessarily perfect. This means that there's more room for accountability and improvement within the justice system as social pressure encourages that justice system to change, seeing that there has been faults to it, bringing light to that recidivism as a negative failure of the justice system. Thirdly, we think that law can be really elitist and perceived as really powerful, wanting to maintain that image. We've told you this at first, why we think this happens. We think this means that they actually have an incentive to want to avoid looking like a failure. What we think this means is they're actually going to take measures to try and make sure that they're actually lowering recidivism, making things better for people when they're in jail and throughout this time. We think that this is always more important because it is actually reducing the negative impacts we told you under our side. This is exclusive to our side of the house when that justice system is trying to avoid that failure. So because we're able to get a more rehabilitation focus from that first sentence, from that second sentence, and we're always able to get better outcomes for the justice system and for all minorities within society.
Panel, literally the only thing that the current criminal justice system cared about was these rich white men who are buddies with the judge in law school, who could hire lawyers who are buddies with the judge in law school, who have the money and the privilege to be able to be taken care of by the legal system. The opposition failed to engage with this. They failed to engage with the fact that these judges would not apply these mitigating factors to these minorities that they cared so much about. And so that is why they lost this debate. I'm going to deal with two things. Firstly, the principle, and then this idea of equity and minorities. Firstly, on the principle. They had this vague principle about how the morality of society was enshrined in the justice system. Firstly, they didn't give an imperative on why we ought to change these mitigating factors to change these morals. Secondly, this was very contingent, and they didn't give any mechanisms on why adding some mitigating factors would somehow change these morals in society. Thirdly, if they admitted that these morals in the justice system were so sexist, were so discriminatory, then they conceded that these mitigating factors, which were at the discretion of the judge to use, would never be used on these minorities, because if the justice system was as discriminatory as they claim, then these judges would never use it. And then finally, again, as Roshan talked about, if you accepted that, no thank you, if you accepted that, then why wouldn't you just never put minorities in jail or have a First Nations court or something like that? That would probably better help the principle. No thank you. On to this idea of equity. So, firstly, at first they came out with this idea in their model that the more severe the sentence was, then there would be more mitigation. So, two responses. Firstly, if it was more severe, then the crime was obviously worse, right? It's probably for someone who is dealing drugs to children, like Roshan said in a BOI. And if this is the case, then we don't want them out of the justice system, because then they're going to deal drugs to more children when they get out, because their sentence has been mitigated, sure.
So actually, the reason that the sentences were more severe is because these racist white judges that you have presented to us disproportionately punish people of colour and members of minority groups.
Okay, once you accept that these judges never use these mitigating factors to help these people. Mitigating factors are at the discretion of the judge to use. The lawyer brings them up, and then they have to consider it's not a mandated thing, and you can never make it a mandated thing. It's not a minimum sentence or a maximum sentence. It's not a mandate. It's mitigating factors, and therefore the judge considers this And if you accepted that, then the judge would never use these mitigating factors on the minorities.
Or no.
Nothing. On to the next. So at first, they gave this really whole spiel about how General was really bad at dehumanized people. But then they didn't give any mechanisms as to why these mitigating factors would actually lead to recidivism. They didn't give any structural reasons. And so their main push, therefore, was that you could fix the problem by giving media attention and analyzing the ideas. And so, what did they say? They said three things. Firstly, they said that the media would somehow bring attention to this. Three responses. Firstly, mitigating factors are technical legal procedures enshrined in law. The media, therefore, didn't have this incentive, because the media cares about salacious things. They didn't have this incentive to analyze this really technical and legal thing. Secondly, the media doesn't equal policy change. And so when we have these alternatives, when we use your fear to make these better alternatives, such as like mandatory body cams or these alternative factors, then we actually get the change for minorities that we care so much about. And then finally, the media is also a very westernized institution. They have a bias against these minorities. So instead of portraying it in a good way, they're probably going to perpetuate that bad messaging. Second thing that they talked about was how the previously incarcerated would have sympathy. Now firstly, do we want the sympathy of murderers for these people? Probably not. And this wouldn't lead to real change, because secondly, it further associates with these murderers, with these minorities. If you're saying these previously incarcerated people have sympathy for these minorities, it further associates them. And then, thirdly, even if you cared about whether these previously incarcerated people cared about these minorities, they were disengaged with the political system, and no thank you. Because they were, if you're a murderer, you probably don't care about politics. And then, finally, they said they would change the social narrative. Again, they didn't give any mechanisms on how they would do this, especially since mitigating factors is such a small thing. And secondly, again, the media probably doesn't have the attention on this thing because it's technical, and they have this bias against these minorities. They don't portray it to change the social narrative like the opposition wanted to tell. They also characterize the crimes that these people committed as crimes of necessity. Firstly, we tell you that these minorities probably don't commit these crimes. They get told that they did. The justice system discriminates them. Police members entrap them. That's the things that lead to this systematic disadvantage. But secondly, our alternatives of mitigating factors and like mandatory body cams or stuff like that are much better ways of dealing with this. Instead of making this a general thing that rich white men can use to perpetuate that inequality, this was principally harmful and also practically harmful, because these rich white men would feel furthermore invincible and able to do their money laundering. Thank you. They said that mitigating factors would lead to a messaging impact. Four responses. Firstly, we deny that they said that mitigating factors would lead to a messaging impact that minorities commit crimes. Four responses. Wait, no. They said that mitigating factors lead to a messaging impact. Firstly, we thought that this messaging impact would further perpetuate inequality, because again, these rich white men can use these and take advantage of them. They didn't respond to the several structural reasons we gave at Roche as to why these mitigating factors likely only apply to these rich white men. We told you that in the case of Matthew Murphy, for example, these judges have a connection and a sympathy to these people, and so they probably sympathize with them. Secondly, again, the opposition admitted that if the justice system was discriminatory like this, then they would never that they would never be used to help these minorities. They said that these people, in a POI, they tried to say that these rich white people were never convicted instead of the sentencing. Well, firstly, sentencing is to do with the judge. The judge decides that. And so, but in the case of convictions, a jury decides that. So there's not this discretion, and so it's more likely these people will be convicted but have a worse sentence. Secondly, a conviction is binary, while a judge's discretion is more subjective. So they can justify using these mitigating factors to help these rich white men. That perpetuates that inequality. And so, finally, they, in a POI second from Roche, They admitted that they would care about a drug dealer dealing drugs to children, and they didn't give an adequate response to that. And so if they accepted that, then that was detrimental to their case, because that just leads to that recidivism. If you're drug dealing to 6-year-olds, the jail rehabilitation process isn't going to help you. You're probably already damaged with your psyche, and so that's not going to help. And if you're let out earlier, you're going to reoffend. And because we got you better results for minorities, because their principle was pretty incoherent, we won this debate. Thank you.
What the negative team misses in this debate is what we told you at first, that people who commit crimes are a deeply, instrumentally unsympathetic stakeholder. People view criminals as evil, as malicious, as walking externalities that need to be eradicated from our society. And so when they tried to co-opt all of our benefits by also introducing a model that discusses mitigating factors, that discusses, crimes of necessity, they missed all of the analysis about why acknowledging the harms of the jail system and the justice system is essential to deconstructing this narrative and making these people more sympathetic to our society. I'm going to answer 4 questions for you in this speech. First of all, do we have a moral imperative to change this motion and implement what we have presented to you? Secondly, what is the societal conception of criminals going to look like, which underpins the 3rd question, what are the outcomes for offenders going to look like? And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about outcomes for minorities and people in society who aren't criminals. Firstly, what we tell you is that the justice system constructs society's conception of moral behaviour and morality. We told you that the things that the justice system does are racist, are sexist and classist, and this was implicitly accepted by the negative team throughout the debate, to the point at which they told you that judges are all really racist, that minorities commit crimes more than rich white men, to the point that these people are going to get off. And so what we tell you is that we have a moral imperative to correct the justice system, which forces the most vulnerable members of our society to be even more downtrodden. What we tell you is that by acknowledging specifically that jail time is a mitigating factor, we necessarily acknowledge that the way that we treat our criminals is itself really, really harmful, and we tell you that this was the reason that the moral imperative was unique under our side. They gave us a few points of information about selling drugs to children, and we tell you that people don't want to sell drugs to children for the fun of it. We think that you only sell drugs to children if you are incredibly destitute and really, really desperate. So to the point at which they want to have mitigating factors for crimes of necessity, this would actually be symmetrical. No, thank you. And because they don't deconstruct the narratives that we do under our side of the house, as I'm going to elucidate for you in a moment, they actually get worse outcomes and more people selling drugs to children. Before I move on to the societal conception of crime, I'm going to take a point.
Does the social narrative not get worse if the perception is that these people are being let off unfairly and just out on the street?
Yeah, so the fact is, to the point at which you introduce mitigating factors, all of that risk also exists under your side of the house, but the difference is what I'm going to talk to you about right now. So secondly, what is the societal conception of crime going to be? We told you at first affirmative that we're going to deconstruct this narrative in 2 ways. Because first of all, we're going to acknowledge that the jail system is incredibly harmful, dehumanising and brutal. And we told you that people innately are more sympathetic towards people that they perceive to be downtrodden, that they perceive to have experienced significant hardship. And we think that necessarily this humanises criminals in the eyes of the public, because they will understand that, sure, you did a bad thing, but also I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you were sexually abused in jail. I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you were beaten up and bashed and attacked for being a trans man, We think that actually, what this does is it creates a more well-rounded human perception of these criminals. And so what this means is that people will have a more holistic view of what needs to be done to these people. The negative team wanted to talk to you a lot about retributive justice. The entire reason that retributive justice is such a popular idea is because people view criminals as evil and malicious. And so the second mechanism that we brought you is that we told you that because minorities are the most important group in this debate who are significantly likely to reoffend because they are committing crimes of necessity, that these people are not evil because they don't want to be committing these crimes, they don't want to be going to jail, they need to steal a loaf of bread to feed their family because otherwise their family and their children are going to starve. And we tell you that the reason that they can't implement these societal narratives, no thank you, is because under their side of the house, this conception that criminals are evil and malicious and that, they are inhuman still remains, right? And we tell you that they have implicitly conceded that this exists to the point at which they wanted to talk to you about all of the harms for minorities and the fact that people are going to be pushing for even more retribution. So let's talk about then, what are the outcomes for offenders going to look like? The first negative wanted to hang their hat on rich people who are committing money laundering. We told you that actually 99.9% of these cases are outside the scope of the debate because the real advantage that rich people have is hiring fancy lawyers who can dazzle and mislead a jury, who aren't legally trained, who don't understand exactly what their role is in the courtroom. And so the reason that this money allows them to get off in the first place is that they never have to face sentencing at all. But even to the extent that that isn't true, it's really nebulous why we care about some rich executive embezzling lots of money from other rich executives. We think that not only is this such a scarce stakeholder in the debate, but also the impact just is not, and I'll take you in a moment, nearly as important as stopping a First Nations Australian from being systematically locked out of future job opportunities and social inclusion. Go right ahead.
Why don't you not invest your political capital in addressing the things that cause First Nations people to be in front of a judge in the first place?
Look, we absolutely ideologically support that, but what we tell you, right, is that this is a necessary first step because we need to deconstruct people's conception of criminals as evil people who need to be eradicated from society. This is the first step, where when we humanise criminal offenders, we are able to then advocate for more long-standing reforms. I can still tell you what our case is, right? So what we also told you, though, is that minorities are actually the most important group. They told you that mitigating factors are not necessarily required to be applied by judges. If this is true, that is symmetrical and their model also does nothing and so is no better or worse than ours. But actually what we tell you is that the whole reason that judges are bad is because they are classist and sexist and look down upon criminals. And because at first affirmative and second affirmative, we told you that not only do we deconstruct narratives about criminals, but also to the point at which we, separate morality from, sex work to feed your family, we also create better societal narratives around a woman's sexuality in the abstract. We remove this idea that a woman's sexuality is taboo, and so sexist narratives in the abstract for all women in society are removed. And so these rich old white men that, don't speak to women actually will have more conception of what these people are like, and so they are more likely under our side to apply these mitigating factors, right? Even if that isn't true, the fact that mitigating factors exist gives these people ammunition to file for future appeal, and necessarily we are going to get more, to the point at which one judge in society isn't going to be hugely racist. That judge might preside over the appeal, we'll still get better outcomes, right? Quickly on outcomes for minorities, we told you to little to no response at second, but because the justice system is a beacon of morality, and because people have necessary links between the crimes committed by members of minorities and that minority in general, when we deconstruct the view that criminals are really evil, we necessarily deconstruct the link that members of this minority are necessarily less moral, are necessarily more dangerous. We deconstruct the idea that you need to clutch your handbag if you get into the elevator with a First Nations person. We deconstruct the idea that women are manipulative and that you need to be really based and red-pilled because they are the root of all evil. So what we tell you, right, is to the point at which even if they win on their most important stakeholder, because we get better outcomes for every single woman, every single First Nations people who haven't committed offences, which are the vast majority of our society, we are always going to win this debate.
Panel, if people view criminals as evil, as Charlie comes out in his intro and tells you, I don't think that reducing their sentences makes people view them any less of a criminal. That is because now they are likely to be on the street more often because their sentences are shorter, particularly more often as they reoffend. That means your drug dealer that's dealing drugs to 6-year-olds is likely to get lesser and lesser jail sentences as they do it again and again. That means people are likely to actually fear criminals more. That is because the justice system now looks like it is being ineffective and letting these people run out into the streets. For an individual who cares about their safety and their protection, I think that's a pretty big reason as to why you would still believe that criminals are evil. And what does that actually lead to, and what are the active harms of this on side opposition? Twofold. Firstly, the first harm is that they were likely to just be harsher sentences initially. We tell you this at first to let literally no response, And that is because there is significant backlash from the people who are like, oh, you definitely can't put that person down the street. Therefore, the initial sentence is likely to be higher, and that mitigating factor is likely to do very little. But secondly, we tell you there is a significant amount of backlash against the minorities of people and no thank you, against the disproportionately affected minorities. That is to say that even individuals who weren't committing criminals still have to receive that backlash because their entire group is feared because there are people who aren't put in jail. That is the unfortunate world we live in. Whilst affirmative, whilst negative doesn't support that world, that is actually just what happens. I know affirmative as well. No thank you, not something we wanted in this debate. Two things. Firstly, how we get a more equitable justice system, and secondly, on why we better decrease recidivism and get better societal outcomes. But note first, we probably care more about getting an equitable justice system, considering our justice system is already quite shit. Okay, let's take a look at what affirmative brings you. They bring you a principle out first. This principle is quite dodgy because what they tell you essentially is that the justice system sets the moral agenda in society, and they tell you that you ought to have a good moral agenda or whatever. Three responses to this. Firstly, we want you to know this does not directly connect to their mitigating factor, right? No, thank you, because you could just improve the justice system and make it more moral any other way, and that principle would still be upheld. So if you could believe that we could implement something that would uphold the morality of the justice system, that principle actually just flipped to us anyway. But second thing to note is that principle was wholly contingent on them getting a better moral outcome. So if they didn't get a better moral outcome, they didn't get that principle, didn't play in this debate. Okay, no thank you. Let's hear what they hear a second. And second out, they create a substantive point. It's just there exists a narrative and a message that when you use the mitigating factors we suggest at first, for example, mitigating factors are based on your minority, people believe that your minority is inherently evil, right? 4 responses. Firstly, we tell you if this is true, opposition supports never doing any affirmative action. They support letting things perpetuate in society because they're too scared that there might be backlash for those individuals. Second thing to note is that we just don't think this narrative exists, right? That is because we have mitigating factors for mental health, and people don't think all people who have mental health are likely to commit crimes, so we just didn't think this messaging occurred. Third response is that we thought that it's probably good for people to know that that disadvantage exists, because we tell you it's probably already bad for these people. When people just believe that the issue is being dealt with whatever dodgy model of affirmative puts in place, we tell you that it's probably bad now that they think the issue has been dealt with. At least we were the ones who identified the issue and probably rallied more people because at least some sort of change was possible to be made. Fourth response is just to say no thank you. Our entire counter model is not just we would have other mitigating factors, it's also we would do things like try and reduce police brutality by having body cams. It's also doing things we would implement laws. No, this was mutually exclusive like we told you at first, because there was a significant amount of buy-in. When you use all of that buy-in for literally people who are reducing mitigating factors because people have already been in jail, you can't then also add other mitigating factors for these minorities because people go, wait, justice is no longer equal, right? So there was a limit to the amount of things you could do. No, thank you. We were the side that got to pick and choose what to do. Okay, then what do they tell you, right? So they tell you that, in a POI at first, and then briefly at third again, that rich people just don't fall in this debate, right? We actually think they do. That is because judges have an incentive, and people who choose which crimes are going to be discussed have an incentive to maintain a facade by prosecuting at least a few of them, or saying, look, we considered a few rich people, we are a good justice system, no thank you. But also we think there are probably a lot of accountability measures in society that probably mean these people are put in. Also I think affirmative would support having accountability measures for these rich people, so you actually have to assume that these rich people do fall into this debate and are likely to be included in this debate. But then what they tell you, what we tell you at first is that often, no thank you, a judge will not apply these sorts of mitigating factors to minorities, but they will apply them to rich people. They say this doesn't occur. They say judges always have to apply it. I'm going to deal with both cases here because either one could be true, right? But a few structural reasons as to why it's likely that a judge can pick and choose. No thank you. First thing to note is they actually just don't have to, right? Because what they can do when they get up and announce a sentence is go, I considered this mitigating factor, but I didn't think it was important for this individual because blah, 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 blah. They could probably do that, right? And what we also thought that third concedes that judges are inherently racist, so they're likely to skirt around this anyway, and therefore they were actually just not going to get any benefits for minorities. But let's take opposition at their best and say that judges will be forced to enforce these mitigating factors, right? Why can they still not reduce inequality? 3 structural reasons. No. 1, we tell you that rich white people can equally engage in their model. That is to say, when you prosecute a rich white person, no, this is something they actually want to do, right? Both sides of the house probably want to prosecute rich white people, so they have to cop that at least some rich white people will be taken into the justice system. We actually think that these people can engage in their model and get benefits from their model. That means, at best, the inequality gap is still there because both the rich people and the minorities can engage with this. But also, at worst, that gap just gets bigger if you believe our characterization when we tell you judges can pick and choose, or just generally when you consider who is actually in the justice system. Second response, no thank you, I'll take you after this, is that the issue is not just in their sentencing, right? That is because police arrest these individuals from like minority backgrounds, even when they haven't committed a crime. Those are the sorts of things like trifecta, they exacerbate the crime even when it hasn't occurred. We were the only team that fixed this. They just exacerbated this issue because they still had to go to the justice system every single time. Sure.
When the criminal justice system says that being First Nations is more or less of a mitigating factor than being trans, that is incredibly harmful to the identities of all members of these groups, regardless of whether they are offenders.
Sure, so we would then just have mitigating factors for both then, but also their issue doesn't solve this because they're also just giving mitigating factors to the rich white people. And also, we tell you, we're actually just happy to deal with the root cause. The mitigating factor was probably not in this debate as much, because what we tell you at first is that the issue that affirmative can never deal with is that, and this is what I just told you just then, that the sentencing is not the issue. The issue is that these people are disproportionately arrested. The issue is that the police view these people inherently as criminals. That doesn't change when you have these mitigating factors. That changes when you implement things for police brutality, when you have that buy-in that we brought out first. No, thank you. Third, we tell you, you are likely to get harsh sentences. I explained that in my intro, but we tell you that's for 3 reasons. Firstly, because of societal backlash. Secondly, because you still need a deterrent. And thirdly, now they have an excuse to just raise it because like, oh, there are mitigating factors, I can read it. No. Okay, then we thought at the end of this, there was actually a significantly worse backlash for, they tell you there's backlash for mitigating factors. But also, we thought this is not the same as reducing police brutality and introducing dash cams. We thought generally people were sympathetic to minorities, right? But when you have their sort of backlash, that is because when you implement their mitigating factor, people believe justice is blind. People have a perception that everyone should be sentenced equally. When you introduce their mitigating factors, that means there is so much more backlash to these minorities. We actually thought that was really harmful. Briefly on the third thing about why do we decrease recidivism and get the best societal outcomes, I thought they kind of give you this case that this mitigating factor sends a message that people would see criminals as all bad. I only really understood this at third, right? But we also just thought that in that instance, opposition to stand for getting rid of jail entirely for these individuals, right? Because they're wasting their political capital by moving the needle a little bit at best. So we didn't actually think they got the outcomes that they cared about in this debate. But also then they tell you there's less recidivism. 2 responses. Firstly, the issue is with minorities constantly returning to the justice system from outside factors. Secondly, we tell you much more rich white people get away with things under their side of the house and are actually incentivized to do it because now they're the profit margin for me money laundering is higher. I'm likely to money launder more because I can get away with it more. At the end of this debate, we got better outcomes for minorities. We got better outcomes generally for society. So proud to propose.
The problems with third half speech coming out and saying that they prevent the social narrative for all women, for all minorities, was that it failed to recognise what we tell you down the bench about the impact that occurs when you perceive the justice system as not being fair, when you don't perceive the justice system as fairly prosecuting people, and when you perceive that they're letting out people who have already re-offended crimes as being let out on the street. And he doesn't recognise the inherent harms that we tell you down the bench occur when you specifically reduce or apply mitigating factors for reoffenders. Those are the specific harms that it only applies to rich white people, that it's likely to actually widen the gap in their worst case because white people were able to exploit these mitigating factors to a greater extent than the actual minorities that they cared about were ever able to. Firstly on this issue of equity, then on the issue of social outcomes. So their final push, and it only really comes out clearly at third, is that they promote the social narrative and tear down the idea that criminals are inherently bad people. But we give you a few responses, primarily at third, because obviously that was the only chance we had to respond to this. But we tell you that the narrative actually gets worse under their side of the house for the reasons that Bella explained. But we also say very clearly that if that was true, then why would you not have, why would you just prevent any form of affirmative action if it was going to cause backlash? We tell you that mitigating factors for minorities is a very effective way at actually recognizing the root causes that have caused them to be in that place. And if the opposition's only response to that is that they will cause backlash and a bad social narrative, then why would we do any affirmative action for any minorities? We also tell you at Bella that they never really prove why this narrative actually gets created by reducing the sentences for minorities. That was never clear. Then on this issue of applying factors, we give you structural reasons right from first as to why it's unlikely that a judge will apply these things. And we tell you at second that it is ultimately up to the discretion of the judge as to whether or not they consider this. We tell you at second and third that the judge can just say, oh, I considered this, but I didn't really think it was that important. But what we do very effectively at Bella is tell you the harms, even if you do buy the opposition's characterization and these mitigating factors do apply. Because what that then means is that these rich white people are able to get away. It doesn't actually do anything because the sentences go up from where they are in the status quo. And it actually just ends up widening the gap in between minorities and between non-minorities. That was a major harm in the opposition's case, and they never effectively dealt with it. Then on the principle, they tell us down, we tell you down the bench that the link between their associated principal harms and the way that they addressed this was never clear. We frequently POI as to why they would never just get rid of jail sentences for people if they were if there was a cause for them doing that. We tell you that our model is actually more effective at addressing those things because it recognizes and prevents the root causes that actually may be causing that person to be recommitting crime. And we tell you, we respond to this down the bench. Then on this issue of social outcomes, we tell you, at first and at third, that there was limited buy-in, for these kinds of programs, and that was why the things that we were able to prop were mutually exclusive to the opposition. Then on this issue, we tell you why these things are so effective at actually getting the kind of change that opposition wanted to promote. We tell you that actually probably addressing the root causes in society would be more effective at addressing the social narrative that opposition wanted to talk about. And we tell you that ultimately our model is better at achieving this. So then what does our model look like? Firstly, we think we don't have the significant backlash that occurs under the opposition side of the house, because people probably aren't going to be super mad that we're recognizing the kind of structural disadvantages that apply to minorities. But secondly, we think that we have more buy-in to actually implement programs that address the kind of issue. And note that under opposition side of the house, all minorities are affected by the social narrative that is created when people have the perception that criminals are being let out onto the street. So proud to oppose.
The entire negative team case was unresponsive to the idea that morality imposed by the broken justice system made minorities unsympathetic, meaning that only affirmative was ever able to get us the outcomes by changing this narrative so that people could be respected within the justice system and gain benefits from that. Three things I'd like to talk about in this reply. Firstly on principles, secondly on the justice system, and finally about minorities. We brought you from first this principled push that we must deconstruct this imposed morality of the justice system, and that one of the ways that we could most notably do this is by changing that emphasis of blame as per the topic. When we brought you this moral imperative, but they failed to bring a moral imperative, not engaging with this and instead accepting it with the idea that they would also want to change the justice system, this principle was ultimately upheld within this debate without much cross-law about it because it was underpinning both teams' idea of wanting to change and mitigating factors. And for those reasons, why that principle was not discussed in great detail, it was clearly substantiated both first and second from affirmative team, and clearly still prevails in this debate as supported by both teams. And for that reason, if ever in doubt about the practicals within this debate, it is so clear that affirmative team was the only one with any principle backing and should be the deciding factor. But let's move on to what the practicals were in this debate. Let's talk about the justice system firstly. Both teams analysed from first that the justice system has a lot of bias in it, and therefore negative told us that these mitigating factors would never work, despite the fact that the counter model that they brought to us as well was also about mitigating factors. So to the extent they wanted to tell us these wouldn't work, they completely eradicated any standing they had in this debate. We told you why ours were more likely to work because they were less entrenched in racism and more likely on the basis of the failure of the justice system. Instead, they told you that we need to focus on redistributive justice. What we told you from affirmative was that this would not work. The reason we told you that this wouldn't work is because these stakeholders are currently unsympathetic. What this means is anything they brought to you throughout their model, which only began to come out towards the end of the debate about wanting to have body cams and wanting to have other forms of justice was never going to work when these stakeholders and these minorities within society were still unsympathetic, still holding the blame for having committed their crimes, not acknowledging the failure of the justice system, which is something we told you was so critical from outside of the House. And this, the idea of these stakeholders being sympathetic and that being so critical was not adequately responded to, because all of the reform on either side of the House in the debate was contingent on this, and this was something that only the affirmative team could do. But we also told you why the benefits they would bring you would actually be harmful in terms of quantifying and labelling people's disadvantage. We also told you 3 other reasons we systemically get better change that weren't responded to. Not only shifting this blame, but also having like this incentive for the legal system to not want to be perceived as having failed, so therefore creating better sentencing from the get-go. We didn't hear a response to this, and because this is so critical, because it affects not only the people sentenced within society, but everyone who engages with the justice system or engages within society as a person is affected by this. Briefly, so we clearly won this point. Briefly on minorities, we proved to you that often these crimes are caused out of necessity. So the way to lower this recidivism was through more rehabilitative and less discriminatory incarceration-based punishments. Something that happened on our side of the House. Quantifying this disadvantage was never going to help them. Instead, we told you at second affirmative that it's far better to be able to shift this blame away from the minorities, because then this is reflecting adequately, not that it's because you're First Nation that you caused a crime, but actually because of what has been imposed on you by the system. This is how we were able to help not only minorities within the justice system who are being disadvantaged, but all minorities within society as they are negatively labelled. This is always at a larger scale than any benefits affirmative team was able to bring you. Even at their best, they were able to guarantee a couple First Nations people had reduced sentences, but this narrative that it was because they were First Nation continued to prevail, and even in that best case, they continued to harm everyone in society who thought that that was the reason for their disadvantage. Because of those reasons, we are so proud to propose and see that it is so clear that we not only on principles, but get better outcomes for the justice system and minorities across society.